Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is David Wiseman, the Vice President of Secure Communications at BlackBerry. David, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And secure communications is a major focus in Washington these days because of the Salt Typhoon hacks into U.S. telecom infrastructure. Understanding this is kind of ongoing, investigation is ongoing, but what are some of your takeaways from this incident? What are you watching?
Yeah, so my takeaways are, this is a pretty serious attack for a couple of reasons. One is it was apparently in our networks for an extended period of time. As a result of that, they were able to collect a lot of metadata, communication patterns, who people communicate with, but also actually listen in to voice calls and read text messages. So that means that there's a lot of information that's been extracted that now can be applied for future attacks, to make those more effective. And maybe we can talk a little bit about deep fakes and things like that at some point here. The other thing around the Salt Typhoon is it really illustrates, at the end of the day, telecom networks have been designed on purpose around connectivity and reachability. You can pick up a phone and reach anyone in the world, and security is a secondary thing, and that's by design. And so that means that people need to accept the fact that there's always going to be vulnerabilities in these networks, and to take that into account about how they conduct their communications.
Yeah, so I think that probably came as a surprise to most folks that U.S. telecom infrastructure is vulnerable to an attack like this, where these hackers were able to lay in wait and collect data for such a long amount of time. What are the vulnerabilities in U.S. telecommunications infrastructure? Why are they so deeply embedded? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's the vulnerability specifically of the U.S. telecommunication infrastructure. I think it's telecommunication networks globally. And the vulnerabilities there's all different mixture of equipment. Some of the equipment's been there for decades. There's just mass quantities of network switches and computers. And it's almost impossible to really know what all you have in your network, particularly with mergers and divestitures that go on in the industry constantly. And so that's just a very large attack surface with a lot of different ways to get in. So if you have a threat actor who has a strong desire to do so, they can probably find a way.
Oh. So, and you mentioned metadata and how, even if these hackers weren't necessarily listening to everyone's voice calls and messages, I think U.S. officials have said it was sort of a limited subset of folks, but there's metadata that they were able to harvest from a lot of these attacks. What was that metadata at a basic level? What can they do with it?
Yeah, so at a basic level, the metadata is who's calling whom, who's messaging whom, how long are they talking, what's the frequency of these types of communications. So if you think about that from an analysis perspective, you can now build out patterns of who's likely to communicate with whom. Is this normal or is this something unusual? Only when something serious is happening do these two people reach out to each other in the middle of the night. So so you can really build that out. So that helps from a intelligence derivation perspective. However, it also helps in terms of if you want to do spoofing attacks and identity attacks, that if I know that these people communicate regularly, and maybe even the time of the day that's most common, if I launch an attack pretending to be one of those people at that point in time, it's a much higher probability the person's going to accept the message, accept the call, and think it's real because it's kind of feels normal. Kind of the difference here is if you look back over the last decade in the news, there's been multiple situations where telecoms have lost large quantities of metadata. Verizon's had that. Last summer there was a situation with AT&T where they lost a year's worth of their data for all of their cellular customers. But the difference there is that was retrospective data. Hey, here's what's happened in the past. Now there is a value for analyzing that, but the difference with the Salt Typhoon is apparently it's more of a real-time nature. So if in real time, all of a sudden this communication pattern is developed, that's a lot more value from an intelligence perspective than knowing in the past what happened. And as a result, by combining that with also being able to get the actual content of text messages, listen into voice calls, you can pump that data into AI platforms at this point, and you can actually build very convincing deep fakes. So not only do you know an optimal time to engage with someone, you can optimally engage with them a text message that has the right tone of how that person's message, or it actually sounds like their voice. And that's why I feel this is a much more serious attack, because we've moved from retrospective to real time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks have become familiar with the type of deepfake calls where, a grandma gets a call from her grandson, supposedly her grandson asking for money because he's in jail, when it's really obviously a deepfake. But obviously these Salt Typhoon attackers are linked to the Chinese government, so this becomes a national security issue, a counterintelligence issue, I guess is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so have we seen this data used in that way to date that we know of, or are we just is this just a big concern that arises out of this attack right now?
Yeah, I would assume that we have to assume that the data has been used.
Yeah.
It's not been made public, how it's been used, and we probably would never know all the ways.
Right.
But if someone's going to this scale of an attack and this level of effort, it has to be for a reason.
And we should mention, I think, as of now, this attack is ongoing. The telecom providers have not all said that they've been able to evict the attackers from their networks.
Correct, and I'm not sure you ever could totally be confident that you've evicted them. Mm-hmm. And this gets back to earlier we discussed kind of design philosophies of telecom networks. So I think going forward, government agencies and even everyday citizens need to just assume that the networks are compromised. You still need to use those networks as a transport and connection mechanism, but you need to protect your actual communications so that they're not compromised as they flow through those networks.
And does this specific Salt Typhoon incident connect to any broader trends that have been building up in just secure comms and mobile security over the last several years?
Yeah, I think it does, in the sense that it's accelerating the recognition that you need to use end-to-end encryption in your communications. If we look at the guidance that CISA published, in December, that's their number one recommendation. And this is general public guidance, but their number one recommendation is use end-to-end encrypted applications, for your communications. And I think that's kind of been building up, slowly, but I think that's really going to accelerate now.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that guidance. You said the number one recommendation was using end-to-end encryption. It had a number of best practices for mobile comms, and this kind of went out to just the general public.
Correct.
CISA said this is especially pertinent to people who might be targeted specifically by these attackers, but this was general public guidance. I mean, that seems like a pretty big step because of this attack.
Oh, it absolutely is, because you also have the concern when you put that type of guidance out, is the public really scared now? And hey, did somebody let me down? I got to do all this. But I think the good thing about the guidance is, for the most part, it was pretty practical. Mm-hmm. Hey, use an encrypted app. I think most people that are used to using a smartphone probably can figure out how to use an encrypted messaging app. And then it gave specific guidance on, if you've got an Android phone or you've got an iOS device, do these settings. It also talked about one of the other concerns, which is identity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a bigger challenge for the average consumer to be able to respond to that advice. But certainly from a government perspective, you need to build on this baseline advice, and identity and protection of metadata and ownership of the systems are, things that agencies are looking at now, beyond just that I have an encrypted data stream.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about perhaps what agencies have been doing, what they could do better in the future. But just, before we end this segment, any other big takeaways just from kind of what we know so far about the Salt Typhoon hacks and just the state of telecom security today?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway here is that not only should you assume those systems are infiltrated and your data is at risk. But now it's becoming much easier to target specific individuals. And you might not feel that your day-to-day business is all that important. But with the combination of the high-end data analytics capabilities now, that might not be the case when communications you're doing is now combined with communications of dozens or hundreds of other people. And when you pull all that together, there's a lot of knowledge that can be extracted. So the big takeaway there is this whole idea of open source intelligence is accelerated. The capabilities of that are accelerated strongly when combined with this new telecom infrastructure infiltration.
So it's not just taking in data for the sake of vacuuming up large amounts of data. You can actually do something with it that perhaps several years ago, before the widespread use of AI, you would not have been able to do.
Correct. I think the bar is lower in terms of resources and skills required to actually be able to leverage this data for nefarious purposes.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about what agencies could be doing or are doing and could be doing better after this break. Again, my guest today is David Wiseman, Vice President of Secure Communications from BlackBerry. I'm Justin Doubleday on the discussion Spying on Mobile and How to Prevent New Interception and Espionage Tactics in a Risky Geopolitical Era, sponsored by BlackBerry on Federal News Network. Welcome back to Spying on Mobile and How to Prevent New Interception and Espionage Tactics in a Risky Geopolitical Era, sponsored by BlackBerry on Federal News Network. Again, my guest is David Wiseman, Vice President of Secure Communications at BlackBerry. David, before the break, we were talking about, obviously, these Salt Typhoon hacks, just how big of a deal this is for everyone, and especially government agencies who have to protect their communications. CISA came out with that guidance that we mentioned in December about using end-to-end encryption, stronger identity authentication measures, a number of other steps. All obviously important steps in light of these hacks, but what are the challenges in implementing some of these things, especially end-to-end encryption?
Actually, I think the end-to-end encryption is the most straightforward part.
Okay.
Because from a technology perspective. The adoption challenge, though, is that means you need to have everyone using the same applications on the endpoints to do the end-to-end encryption between those applications. So I think one of the areas that are going to be important over the next year or so is how do you enable interconnectivity between encrypted applications. The identity topic is a lot more difficult. And I think for two reasons. One, a lot of times, if you talk about things like multi-factor authentications, an actual government employee, an actual citizen, they don't necessarily have control over how the system they're using is doing that. And different techniques, it kind of builds a confusion, and so it's easy to make mistakes. And some of the things they talk about around hardware keys and things like that, not everyone's up to understanding how to use that. But the other challenge on the identity is, since so much information has already gotten out there, there's already a mapping of numbers to people. And people rarely change their phone number. It's a really big hassle. A lot of times they're going to have their number for decades. So what that means is even as things are tightened up, in a sense the damage has already occurred. And someone may be a junior official now, 5-10 years from now, they're in a very senior role, they still got the same phone number. Threat actors can pull that back and start to use that to specifically target that individual. So that's why I feel like the identity is a real challenge topic there. And then the third one is a lot of the advice that CISA gave to the general public is how should you configure your phones or your devices? What policies should you set? And for the government, there are tools that you can be used for device management to enforce those, as well as other policies that are important at a governmental level. But sometimes those efforts kind of go counter to the ongoing efforts around BYOD, or bring your own device. And we're going to have to find a new balance there. Maybe we had gone too far to one side.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the wake of the pandemic, obviously there was this push to ensure folks can still collaborate, use perhaps their own devices more frequently for government work. But as you said, there's this tension kind of between sometimes access and collaboration and security. What do you think CISOs in government will be focused on in terms of securing their enterprises? Are there practical steps that they can take in the next 6 months to a year that you think are important?
Yeah, and I've talked to a number of CISOs and CIOs over the past month on this very topic, and they already are, taking that CISA guidance as a baseline and moving as a first step to the end-to-end encrypted. Now, our discussions are when they do that with consumer grade systems, public systems, you still have the identity risk, but you also have the challenge of the government now no longer has access to the metadata. So that means it's difficult for them to be compliant with things such as Federal Records Acts, Presidential Records Acts. So I think they see this first step is it's something we need to do immediately to mitigate a clear and present danger, to steal that phrase. But at the same time, they're saying, hey, over the next year or so, I got to have that capability, but I still need to do a better job on protecting identities, knowing who's on the network. I need to be able to still make sure I own and control my data so I can be compliant with different regulations. So I think that's the next thing they're starting to think about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then obviously they've been thinking and acting on the zero trust strategy that came out back early in 2022. That included some of these initiatives that we've been talking about today, from data encryption to identity. Do you have a sense of the state of where agencies are at in that push, specifically on those initiatives too? Are they kind of midway there, or?
Well, I think it varies by agency, but I think there's a lot of progress that's been made. But I think now that philosophy of the zero trust needs to actually extend out to the use of mobile devices. So the zero trust has been there on your mobile device if you're going to connect to a system. You go through different authentication techniques. But it hadn't really extended to I'm placing a phone call, I'm trading messages with people, and now it's got to move to that next phase.
Yeah, and I think CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, has had a lot of guidance on mobile security, has done some work with other agencies in that effort. Are there any specific federal mobile security initiatives that you're kind of watching to maybe pick up on some of these efforts?
Yeah, so we see ones that are, have been in place but kind of growing to allow, higher and higher levels of sensitivity to even classified use on a mobile device. And how do you, put the necessary protections in place? Because we kind of get to this trade-off of quick response time, reaching people when you need to reach them, versus, keeping it as secure as needed. And the model of, hey, I've got to get back to the office to use a particular phone to have a certain conversation, that kind of breaks down when you look at how fast things are moving in the world now. And our adversaries, they'd be glad if you spend 90 minutes getting to the office versus starting to deal with the situation. So that's been going on a while, but I think that's ramping up even more. And how do you move away from having to have very specialized and expensive equipment to do that, to actually being able to do it on a device that people feel comfortable carrying around?
Yeah. Does there need to be new funding for these types of efforts? Is it in agency budgets today? Is it a matter of just reprioritizing, or how expensive do you think these shifts will be ultimately?
I think at a high level, you're probably talking about something like doubling the cost of what you spend on telecom right now, which is a significant number, but it's not a dramatic number. Okay. But the key thing also is understanding who has what requirements, because you don't want to give everyone the most expensive requirement, because it's not just a matter of cost. It means you're putting certain restrictions on what they can do.
Okay.
So there's a lot of policy things there. Are there a lot of allocated budget line items currently? No, for unclassified communications. But I think that's actually going to change, that there's going to be requirements to protect those communications, which means there's going to be budget allocations to support that.
Yeah, I think that gets us a little bit back to Salt Typhoon and how, we have a new administration, we have a new Congress. They are going to react to this in some form or fashion. We've talked a lot practically about what agencies can do, but at a high level, at a policy level, what are you watching for over these next 6 months to see how this new administration, this new Congress, puts forward ideas to get folks to where they need to be with secure communications?
Yeah. So I think, the part about, there's going to be continued focus on, understanding what actually happened and how can we respond to it. But I think one of the outcomes of that's going to be a big discussion around, and this gets also to a big tech discussion of, do we really want to move our government communications to large technology company platforms that are open to the public, that the government has no control over? They could be sold off, who knows what can happen. Or do we need to have our government communications in an environment that gives the same capabilities of those, consumer systems, but can be under the control of government? Because only if the system's under control in terms of data sovereignty, in terms of who's utilizing the system, and even in terms of what networks are being traversed, can you really protect it. So it's a little bit of a shift from, we've talked a lot over the past probably decade about the consumerization of IT. I think on the communication side for government, we might see more of an insourcing of that once again, where you recognizing, some of the risks there, things around identity, things around the metadata, that more and more the government may say, hey, for certain situations, we actually need a system that we have control over.
Does that get us into a cloud conversation as well?
I think it's a little bit independent of cloud specifically.
Okay.
Now, certainly, for when you get to a classified system, that becomes a very strong discussion.
Right.
But it's more about control of the system and who's controlling that cloud environment.
Okay.
Yeah. Versus, so there's a difference between I'm deploying a system in an Azure and AWS, federal approved cloud area, but I'm kind of managing, controlling that system, versus, hey, I'm using this big consumer environment like a WhatsApp or a Signal that I'll never have any control over it, even though all of that stuff may be running in the cloud.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. Any final thoughts just on Salt Typhoon or secure communications generally?
Yeah. While this is a new topic for the general public, at BlackBerry, we've been focused on securing communication for decades, and specifically government communications, and doing things, working closely with NSA around certifications. And so we're glad to be able to bring this long experience to agencies at a time when it's now a critical issue for them.
David Wiseman is Vice President of Secure Communications at BlackBerry. David, thanks again for coming in.
Thank you.
I'm Justin Doubleday, and for more on this discussion, visit federalnews.com and search BlackBerry.